The Black Death. In 1347, the world began to change forever. Across Europe, Asia, and Africa, a terrifying illness swept across the land, killing millions of people in its wake. The sick were met with gruesome symptoms, including painful boils, high fevers, bleeding, diarrhea, and gangrenous swellings, which would often develop into buboes. If they survived that, death by suffocation or exsanguination was not out of the question either. The plague killed so many people, it altered the course of history, ending feudalism, changing the relationship between labor and capital, allowing for new artistic ideas to flourish, and much more. But what exactly was this illness, and how did it impact the world? This is the Black Death. Our story starts in Asia, likely in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan, where a group of traders were tending to their sick. Among them were two men who had contracted the bubonic plague from rodents. Though at first they thought they had just come down with a fever, as the days went on, their condition got worse. They developed ulcers on their groin and under their armpits. In fact, one of these traders had a particularly large swelling under his armpit, which would come to define the plague. These painful boils would eventually rupture, releasing pus and blood, which gave way to horrifyingly vivid nightmares. The trader died shortly after. Though this plague had been around since at least the time of the Roman Empire, at the time it was known as pestilence. It wasn't until this outbreak that it earned the nickname Black Death. As the weeks went on, more and more cases started popping up among the trading communities. Before long, the disease began spreading outwards along trade routes. By the end of the year, the plague had made its way to the Middle East and North Africa, and in 1348, it hit the Italian port of Messina. At first, the local clergy assumed that the newcomers had just come down with a regular fever. But before long, whole families were succumbing to the disease. Within months, hundreds of thousands of Italians had been wiped out. The rich fled inland, while those who couldn't left the city in what would become known as the Dance of Death. As the summer wore on, the plague continued spreading north through France and England. King Edward III, who had come down with the illness, managed to survive, but not before losing his wife, Queen Philippa, and 4 of his children. Soon, no one was safe. There were simply too many victims. In some villages, nobody survived. Entire communities were wiped off the face of the earth. Some places saw 100% mortality. Overall, it is estimated that around 25 million people died in this outbreak, roughly 60% of the population. The first place the Black Death struck with full force was, believe it or not, England. While scholars debate whether or not the country was truly hit harder than others, there's no doubt that it impacted England in ways no other country could have predicted. For starters, there were far fewer farmers to harvest the land, which led to food shortages. When the peasants started dying, the wealthy English landowners didn't know what to do. What were they supposed to do with all their sheep? Farmers were already starting to adopt new technologies that allowed them to raise more sheep on less land, which meant there were more sheep than ever before. With nobody to take care of them, these sheep were left to roam the countryside with nobody to shear them. Wool prices plummeted, and England lost its dominant position in the wool trade. But that wasn't the only thing that Black Death changed in England. After the plague, a shortage of labor caused wages to increase. Wages for agricultural workers nearly doubled. However, the Parliament resisted these higher wages, passing laws that attempted to cap wages at pre-plague levels. But this didn't stop the inevitable. Workers simply refused to work for such low wages. Labor shortages also hit the English town of Stratford badly, causing wages to double. Shakespeare, the famous playwright, would later immortalize this uprising in his play, King Lear. In it, he wrote about how the king became furious when he heard about the peasants wanting to be paid more. "How is it that thou art not in prison? What a plague is this that the king's officers are so infected that they cannot tell a true report?" He might have written this during a time where the townspeople were actually calling for the king to be overthrown. Needless to say, the king did not appreciate the sentiment. As a result of the plague and the subsequent labor shortages, serfdom was effectively ended in England. While there were still many poor rural people, they were free to move to the cities and find new work. This resulted in the rise of a new class of people called yeomen. These were independent farmers who owned their own land and worked it themselves. Because of the lack of shepherds, farmers found that they could use their fields to graze cattle rather than sheep. As a result, Meat became cheaper and more common in the English diet. Overall, the Black Death is considered to be one of the major factors that helped to end feudalism in England. But the plague did not just impact England. It spread throughout the entirety of Western Europe, even reaching as far north as Scandinavia. A popular theory is that the plague bacteria arrived in Norway via rats that stowed away on Venetian ships. Historians once thought that the plague may have been brought to Norway by the Teutonic Order, a holy order founded in 1188 that was originally tasked with protecting pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land. However, there is little evidence to support this claim. While the Black Death would kill an estimated 37% of Norwegians, the immediate impact was devastating. That summer, King Magnus VI came down with the plague and died. As the disease continued to spread, the nobility began to flee the cities for the countryside. This meant that the burden of caring for the sick fell onto the lower classes. Some historians believe that this experience fostered greater solidarity between different classes in Norway, which may have contributed to the egalitarian culture of the Viking Age. Others argue that the effects of the plague weren't quite so positive. After all, the majority of the population had just died. In the aftermath, there were massive shortages of priests, lawyers, and even judges. Many public institutions were unable to function properly, and the economy was in sharp decline. Even though things seemed bleak, it was nothing compared to what was going on in France. In 1348, the plague reached Normandy, quickly spreading to Paris. The royal court, desperate to escape the disease, relocated to the city of Tours, where they hoped they would be safe. But the plague followed them like a dark cloud. One after another, the royal family succumbed to the disease. King John de Guth, who had recently come to power, was one of the last to fall. His death meant that the French throne passed to his 9-year-old son, King Charles V, who would go on to reign for 48 years. Paris saw over 100,000 deaths, roughly half of the population. To make matters worse, mass graves were overflowing, so the Parisians began throwing the bodies into the Seine River. Other survivors fled the city, but they didn't escape the plague. Instead, they spread it to the countryside. Villages that were miles away from Paris saw hundreds of people die each week. In total, it is estimated that the Black Death killed around 1/3 of France's population. Perhaps nowhere was hit harder than the Italian peninsula. Italy was the cultural and economic center of Europe, and it took a massive hit. According to Boccaccio, an Italian author who lived through the plague, the disease first came to Italy via trading ships. These ships arrived in Sicily, where the disease ravaged the population. From there, it spread to Naples, where an estimated 40% of the population died. Florence was perhaps the hardest hit city in Italy, losing an estimated 60% of its population. Though the plague eventually subsided, it returned to Italy 3 more times, each time killing thousands more. In the end, it is estimated that the Black Death killed between 30 and 50% of Italians. To make matters worse, the plague coincided with the rise of humanism, a philosophical movement that placed emphasis on human reason and ethics. Humanists argued that life on Earth was worth living and should be celebrated. Yet the Black Death was killing off large numbers of Europeans at a time when intellectual life was becoming more secular and focused on humanity. Scholars began exploring how a seemingly rational world could allow such irrational suffering. This influenced artists like William Shakespeare, who explored themes of death, grief, and loss in many of his plays. To learn more ways the plague impacted art, stay tuned for more information.